All right, hello and welcome everyone to our Community Solar webinar. We're going to give it maybe one more minute just to let some more viewers file in before we get started here. And as people file in, just to run through a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. First off, this presentation is being recorded and it will be sent out to attendees by email after the presentation is over. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat and they will go to our moderator and we will address them in the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. All right, so what is community solar? First off, my name is Karsten and I work for EcoWatch. EcoWatch is a long-standing leader in environmental news. It's an environmental media group founded back in the mid-2000s in Ohio and is dedicated to publishing quality science-based content on environmental issues, causes, and most importantly, solutions. It's grown from a grassroots newspaper and has since grown into a large website and a large media group, and it's committed to creating a sustainable future. And I am Karsten Neumeister. I'm the energy editor for EcoWatch. I'm based in New Orleans, Louisiana. I've been working in the solar industry for going on 3 years at this point. I started doing private installations throughout Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, working in Public Service Commission campaigns and NOLA Solar for All initiatives, as well as just clean energy advocacy throughout the Southeast. So I cover a lot of solar here at EcoWatch, and just to go over solar really quick before we dive into community solar, I'm sure most people are familiar with the pros of solar energy, but of course, just to recap, solar is a renewable energy source, meaning it's inexhaustible. It helps to reduce electricity costs. It's, of course, provides energy independence, which makes you, protects you from outages as well as unpredictable fluctuations in utility rates, and increases your safety in that way as well. The cons of solar energy as it grows in popularity, and we're starting to realize these challenges and try to address these challenges and find solutions. But the biggest challenges to solar energy at the moment are, one, the manufacturing process is not perfect at this point. There are still some flaws there, as well as with the end of life cycle, meaning what do you do with the solar panel once its life cycle is over. But the biggest drawback of solar panels at the moment is that not everyone can install them. Whether it's a price, it's just too expensive. Solar systems usually cost around $20,000 to $30,000 in total. On average, they can be even more. So some people are priced out. Other people simply don't have homes that can install solar panels, whether it's a roof that's the wrong size, the wrong material, maybe they live in an apartment, but at the moment there are downsides in that way that can prohibit people from installing solar and collecting those benefits. So in response to those challenges, one of the most common solutions and a really promising solution is the idea of community solar or shared solar. So with that, I will be turning it over to my peers Corey and Fatima with Solar United Neighbors, who are here to tell you about the basics of community solar. So Corey, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Karsten, and thanks for having us on today. It's nice to see and have everybody here. As Karsten mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about community solar basics today and go through hopefully answering as many of your questions as we're able to do. And I'm going to start that off with a couple slides. Then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Fatima here for a little bit, and then she'll hand it back to me for us to go over all of these topics. So please feel free to ask your questions along the way, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to answer anything that we don't cover in this presentation. Karsten, I'm not seeing an option to advance those slides. Oh, okay, perfect. So as I mentioned, Corey Ramsden, I'm the head of our Go Solar programs here at Solar United Neighbors. We're a nonprofit organization, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Been in the solar industry, as you can see, since 2011, doing installations, working for online sales companies along the way, and being a volunteer all throughout, which ultimately is how I ended up in the current role that I'm in, which I've been here since 2015, doing work on the ground in Maryland as well as nationally now as part of our Go Solar programs department here at Solar United Neighbors. Next slide. I'm just going to ask Fatima to come off mute there for a minute and say a little bit about her.
Yeah, thank you, Corey, and welcome everyone. This is Fatima Ghani. I'm Go Solar Specialist at Solar United Neighbors and Corey's team. I've been with Solar United Neighbors in the beginning of this year, an upcoming solar professional and a climate change and sustainability researcher. I live in New Jersey and excited to share about community solar and our work here at Solar United Neighbors. Back to you, Corey.
Thanks. So this content you're about to see here is part of a larger series that we did, I guess almost about 2 summers ago now, which is update periodically, and that is on community solar. You'll actually see that on our YouTube channel. This is the first part of that series on consumer basics, but you can see we've got a couple other episodes as well to learn a little bit more about the different types of community solar programs out there, and dive in a little bit more about what it takes to potentially even develop or participate actively in putting together a project as opposed to just being a consumer, both of which are possible in many of these programs throughout the country. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more, suggest heading over to our YouTube channel to take a look at those other 2 episodes as well. Next slide. And just a pause to kind of go back again about Solar United Neighbors. We are ultimately an organization that is helping people access solar and other forms of renewable energy increasingly as well, to be able to help them understand how it works from a consumer education perspective, which is what we call the Go Solar part of our mission. Join Together, which is connecting with others who are also interested in this, whether it's movie screenings or social events, which we do in some places, as well as advocacy, which is one of the primary things that we focus on. So that's Go Solar, Join Together, and then Fight for Your Energy Rights. So one of the things that we spend our time on, in addition to helping people go solar, is actually helping to organize individuals and other organizations and businesses around making positive change at the state, local, and increasingly at the federal level around solar policies. And it might be something as specific as a permitting change in a city, all the way up to supporting the Inflation Reduction Act that just passed, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. So that's really what we're geared for, is bringing people together, helping them, and then ultimately organizing some or as many of them as possible around making political change around solar energy. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over here to Fatima to talk a little bit about some of the things you need to know before we really get into community solar for the next couple of slides, and then I'll come back and finish up. Fatima, take it away.
Thank you, Corey. So as Corey mentioned about Solar United Neighbors, we rely entirely upon community engagement and involvement. And how we do for rooftop solar is we organize solar co-ops where a number of neighbors come together in a group and go solar together. And this way they have a community approach, and our experts here at Sun guide them through every stage of the solar process, and co-op members leverage the bulk purchasing power to get discounted prices. But when we talk of rooftop solar, let me tell you, till date, Solar United Neighbors has organized more than 370 solar co-ops, helping around 7,800 people and small businesses go solar, generating 64 megawatt of installed solar capacity till date. When we talk of rooftop solar, let's take a look at what makes a good roof for solar. If you're installing solar on your rooftop or having a ground mount installation, we look for relatively unshaded area, both for roof and ground mount, which is facing south preferably. East and west are also good, but north in our case, the areas which we live in doesn't get as much of solar. So orientation south is preferred. Another thing we look for is enough space on the roof or on the ground. So somewhere we talk about 200 square feet of roof space, which is uninterrupted of any vents or dorms. And the last thing we look for is the condition and the age of the roof. A solar system which sits on top of a roof is generally for about 25 years. So if you have a roof which is aging or the condition is not good and that needs to be replaced once the system is on, we always recommend having a new roof or a close to new roof with an age of about 10 years. Next slide, please. So this was about a good roof. Then what is not such a good roof or a bad roof for solar? So a roof in poor condition that needs replacement. Then we talked about orientation, we talked about the condition and age. There are certain other physical considerations that can be a barrier for someone wanting to go solar. So anybody who is staying in a rented accommodation, it's a house, it has a roof, but it's rented. That person doesn't own the part of the roof on which the solar array goes, so they can be prevented from going in for solar. And people who are staying in shared accommodations and apartments where they're sharing the roof with so many other residents, they would also be prevented from going solar. So is rooftop solar the only option, or do we have alternatives? Here at Sun, we are committed to expanding access to solar and its benefits to everyone, and there are alternatives. I will give it back to Corey to share a little bit more about the alternatives available to everyone.
Thanks, Fatima. Next slide, please. So part of what we're talking about here is filling in those gaps for somebody who is a homeowner who can't install solar because of some of the things that Fatima mentioned in terms of your quality of your roof, the age of the roof, maybe the orientation or shading, or maybe you are unable to access financing and don't have cash to pay for it up front. These are things that might prevent somebody. Some other things that might prevent somebody from putting solar on their property is that they're a renter or they live in a condo and don't have control over their roof, as well as a number of other reasons. So we, as Solar United Neighbors, want to make sure that we're supporting all options that provide people direct access to solar. And one of those is community solar, sharing solar. And so we're not talking about the cooperative model in this case that Fatima described, where we're helping people go solar in groups to put it on their own properties. We're talking about sharing solar where it is a single array that's installed somewhere nearby, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but installed somewhere nearby that is then sharing the electricity output benefits. So not directly connected to your home, not the actual electrons, but some form of credit that comes as a result of you participating or subscribing in that array. One thing that we just want to make sure we're talking about in terms of clarifying is it's not that rooftop co-op model we mentioned or that bulk purchase, but it's also not what some people refer to as green power credits or renewable energy credits, which are similar, where somebody is buying the green value of the electricity or participating in what sometimes can be called like a green tariff program from a utility, where you're signing up for some sort of sourced renewable energy from some other location. Community solar is differentiated there in that it is inherently local. It is somewhere in your community. Usually regulations define that as in the utility area. So if you live in a utility that has a really wide geographic area, that array might be far from you, but generally speaking, it's going to be in the same utility service area as you are. So that electricity, those electrons, they are going into your local grid, and you're able to access that and benefit from that, even though you may not be able to put it on your property. Next slide. Just a little bit about it. Like we said, this is shared power. It's just a graphic sort of visual representation of that. The size and the portion that you might subscribe to from that array that's located somewhere else in your community is variable. So you might not need a whole big chunk of it. You might just need enough to cover your own electricity needs for the year, but you could have another subscriber of that same solar array that would need a much larger subscription. So that it's proportional to your needs, and it lets a lot of different types of organizations and individuals participate in a single array. Next slide. So we talked about this a little bit already, but just to kind of go over it all together here, it's installed somewhere other than your property. Could be down the street, could be a couple miles away, but it's going to be somewhere else. The location also depends on the what's best in your area in terms of like good sites for solar. That could be a large warehouse, it could be a parking lot, it could be a green field, say unproductive land that's on a farm but maybe is not necessarily good for farming. You might be able to use that land for this purpose. There are brownfields, for example. These are all locations where solar could be sited and then shared. And as I mentioned, it's proportional, so you're able to split it up in different chunks for different electricity needs for particular participants. And that the secret sauce of this community solar really is, and it depends a little how this works based on the state regulations that implement it, but ultimately it is a way to virtually credit the electricity output, assign some value to it, and then apply it to your utility bill so that you receive the benefit of that output. Next slide. This I love this picture because this is actually a picture of some individuals who were organizing a solar array for themselves. So this is not owned by a third party where people are subscribing as customers. They actually built and operated this. They contracted to have it built, obviously, but they're actually the owners of the system itself. That's less common in community solar right now, but it's something we certainly support and want to see more of. But in terms of like why, generally speaking, community solar is important, one of the main reasons is just providing people with a cheaper form of electricity that they can access through these programs. It depends on where you are as to like what that savings looks like, but generally speaking, in state programs that we've been connected with, you'll see anywhere from 5 to 20% savings underneath the cost of utility electricity in that area. And the offerings we'll get into a little bit more later, but those are generally kind of savings rates somebody might expect to see. The reason it's really important, though, is fair access to solar for everyone, including people who can't put it on their roof for whatever circumstances, the things we've talked about before, and that wider participation in clean energy, in the clean energy economy. So from Solar United Neighbors' perspective, those are more people that are benefiting directly. Those are more people that potentially are willing to advocate to increase policies that make sure that happens for all over, and then increase solar renewable energy adoption as well. And then the last one I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, which is that sort of community-based power. And community-based can have a lot of different reasons behind it or meanings. At a minimum, it's people participating collectively as customers, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is people actively developing a project on their own behalf, which I said is less common, but certainly possible with a lot of these programs. And that's not a topic we're going to talk in depth about today, but we do have some content on that in our YouTube series, and we certainly welcome questions at the end if people have them. But today we're focusing more on sort of the consumer side of being a participant or a subscriber to one of these facilities. Next slide. So just kind of bring it all together with this visual here. You've got an array that's somewhere else in your utility area. It's connected directly to the grid. Those electrons that come from that array flow right into the utility system and get distributed, usually to homes and businesses nearby where that array is. The utility is then in charge of monitoring the output of that array. The owner of the array specifies how many people are participating and what percentage of that output or what percentage of those kilowatt hours that get produced on a monthly basis, where those get assigned virtually to people's bills. So, and the utility applies those credits to the customer. The customer then in turn buys or participates with a subscriber organization to be on that particular facility. So we have an example later on of what that billing looks like, but the general idea is that the combination of what you pay the company that runs the array and what your utility bill is, that the combination of those two should be less than what you paid before for solar energy. And that'll hopefully become more clear with a billing slide we have a little later on. Next slide. So as I mentioned just a minute ago, we're talking about subscribing to solar energy. There are other ways to participate, which we won't get into detail today in terms of hosting an array and even potentially even supporting developing a project yourself. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit more about shopping. You've heard me mention a minute ago kilowatt hours. Really, that's what we're talking about here as a consumer, is that you are subscribing to some number of kilowatt hours. It might vary from month to month. Matter of fact, it probably will. And that is what you're typically buying on your utility bill. So your average consumer is paying for kilowatt hours, that's energy, as opposed to kilowatts, which is power, or like the instantaneous amount of ability to do work from the array. So you'll see people talk about like a 10 kilowatt solar array on somebody's roof, or in this case for community solar arrays, they might be 2 or 3 or even 5 megawatts of capacity. That's its ability to produce energy. But the energy itself, or those kilowatt hours, that's what's flowing over time into the grid. That's what the utility is measuring from that community solar array. And that's what's getting virtually credited to your bill if you're participating in that array. So that's the mechanism for delivering the value, are those kilowatt hours, and how many of them that you subscribe to for your community solar participation. Next slide. There are a number of different ways that those subscriptions are set up. These are largely a function of the project owner or whoever's selling you the community solar subscription. So those can come in a bunch of different varieties. Per kilowatt hour, which is what we just talked about, is the one that's most common. And we are starting to see more and more that the most likely version of that per kilowatt hour is actually a percentage below your utility rate. So if you think about that, it's a relatively easy thing for a consumer to understand, is that rather than saying I'm going to buy X number of kilowatt hours at 10 cents per kilowatt hour or whatever that is, that's a little hard for most folks to wrap their heads around, because people don't pay a lot of attention to their utility bill. So in order for that to be sort of a simpler transaction, we're starting to see that the community solar industry spends usually will try to offer these things as a percentage below the retail rate for electricity in that area. So as I mentioned at the beginning, 5 to 20% is kind of average. You'll probably see an offer if you have community solar available in your area that says 10% below the utility rate. Now that utility rate might go up over time, but the idea or the premise is that your subscription to the community solar facility is always going to offer 10% below whatever the current rate is. So it's kind of like locking in your electricity savings over whatever time period you have for your contract. And those contract terms are generally relatively short, or they're becoming shorter in different markets over time, which is a reflection of how easy it is for system owners to think that they can find additional customers. But we can talk about that a little bit at the end if there's time. And then the last thing to note here on that slide, is the escalator. In some contracts, if you are paying by kilowatt hour, you will see potentially that the rate will go up at some predetermined interval or rate over time, usually 1 to 2%, something to be aware of if you're going to be, subscribing. Next slide. So this is that billing example that I mentioned earlier. We're going to go through this. Pardon me, I got a little tickle in my throat there. We're going to be going through this in the next couple slides. Generally, if you can look at the amount, what we're talking about is on the right, what you pay to the utility before community solar. You go to next slide. On the left, you have a rate that you're paying the community solar, community solar subscriber organization. And on the right, you are seeing the bill that you would have paid to that you're paying to the utility that reflects that credit you got. And now you can see the combination of those two bills, the $84 and the $52, is less than what you paid before, that $150. So that's the savings proposition there, that you are getting. The combination of those bills is less than what you paid before. In some markets, you might see all of that on one bill, but right now in most of community solar markets, you're getting a bill from the subscriber organization and a bill from the utility, which is a little confusing for folks, but that's currently the way that functions. Next slide. So you can see it's just pointing out that 150 is now 136 in this example in terms of the savings. Next. The shopping for community solar is something that can be a little confusing depending on what state you're in. Not all states have listings of projects or providers. And so we and other organizations out there have tried to kind of fill that gap. So we have something, what we call our community solar education and subscription platform. It's at cs.solarunitedneighbors.org. But what you're looking at here is just an example of that, which is some information about what community solar is, a lot of the content you're seeing here, how it works, and then if we know about projects in your area, being able to connect you so that you can see where those projects are and how to subscribe to them. Next slide. So you can see that address link is listed there as well, and the shopping site will welcome you visiting there. You won't see offerings all throughout the country. We have limited resources, so we don't have every state covered that has community solar. We're working in that direction. But if you go to that site and don't see a project in your area, feel free to contact us at that email address you see listed there. Our goal really is to make sure people have the information they need to be able to connect with clean energy in their area. So we're constantly answering questions from all over the country of all stripe and sort about rooftop solar, community solar, and lots of adjacent topics. So if you ever are looking for that information, not sure where to ask or who to talk to, feel free to get in touch with us. We're happy to either share with you what we know or try to find the right place to direct you so that you can learn more about your whatever question you're asking. So I think there I'm going to stop for questions. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to listen to any questions that people have about community solar. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Corey. That was great. And we have a list of questions here we can get started with. The first being, can renters use community solar?
Renters absolutely can. It's one of the main reasons why we're so eager to support this, is that it provides access to people who do rent. One caveat there is that if you rent and you don't pay your electricity bill, in other words, it's like part of your rent, that may or may not be possible for you to participate depending on the state program. But generally speaking, if you have a bill from the utility company and you have community solar in your area, you should be able to participate in community solar.
Great. And Corey, you also touched on that the process looks different in every state. Is community solar available in every state, or does the process just change, or is it legally not allowed in some areas, or how does it differ from state to state?
Thank you. It is not available everywhere, something we and others are working hard to change. It is a state-by-state thing at this point. I would say, I'm forgetting the exact number right now, but it's somewhere between like 22 and 26, roughly, states that have some form of legislatively mandated community solar. In other words, the state requires that at least some utilities offer it, typically the investor-owned utilities. So if you live in an area with an electric cooperative or a municipal utility, they may not be participating in the state program that varies by state, but they may have their own program they've created. So utility companies in some states that don't have it statewide, sometimes the utility companies themselves will have a program, and sometimes they're okay. Sometimes, they might actually cost you more than what your regular service is. So that is a little bit of a mixed bag. But it is not available nationwide, unfortunately, at this point, where it's sort of working its way across the country. The most states all together, there's quite a number of them in the Northeast. Some other large programs are in Minnesota, Illinois. Colorado has one of the first ones that was established, and several others that are contemplating community solar in the future. So hopefully more coming in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. And on that topic, we have a question from Nancy asking, is it available in California? And I believe, if memory serves, a bill was passed maybe last month in California. I'm curious if either of you can speak to its availability in the state.
We expect that it will be based on that, but I have to say I don't know too many details about what that program will look like in California. So I'm a hopeful but tentative yes.
Great. Thank you for that. Our next question would be, I'm concerned about the environmental impact of solar panels. Are they being created more sustainably these days?
They are, and I don't have the exact number for right now, but even as of a couple of years ago, the life cycle, like the embodied energy of producing a panel of any kind, whether it's community solar or on rooftop, is generally only a couple of years. So in other words, the panel lasts for 20 some odd years, sometimes even longer, but the energy and the things that went into it to produce it is getting smaller and smaller because of those manufacturing efficiencies. One of the challenges, which Karsten, I think you mentioned at the beginning, is that there are lots of different ways to recycle community solar panels now. But to my knowledge, most of them are still more expensive than the salvage value that comes from it. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done with respect to mandating, incentivizing, and otherwise encouraging manufacturers and developers, for that matter, to be able to actually recycle that equipment at the end of life. The good news is that end of life is usually a long way away, 25 years plus. So we want to see the projects that go in the ground now operate as long as possible, so that they don't need to hit that. And it's something that, as the industry is growing, we're already seeing a lot of additional pressure start to come to bear to be able to create those incentives and those programs to make sure that recycling happens, just the way it did with car batteries, for example, where 99% plus of car batteries are recyclable now because those systems exist and manufacturers participate. That's something that we expect will happen in solar as well, but we're definitely not there yet. Definitely, especially in the United States. Europe has some more specific laws they've already implemented, but it's certainly a work in progress.
And just to add to that, Karsten, another perspective to look at it is, if someone's going solar, the amount of carbon emissions they are offsetting, not burning fossil fuels. So that's another perspective to look at it.
Yes, thank you, Fatima. I believe I saw a statistic around the solar panels are about 90% less carbon intensive than most other conventional forms of electricity. Even though they aren't perfect, they're certainly one of the best steps in the right direction that we have available. So next question would be, how does someone qualify for community solar?
The rules vary by state, but by and large, if you are a customer with a utility bill, you should qualify. That means that in most programs, businesses, nonprofit organizations, individual customers are going to qualify. Where it gets more specific to the state program is if there is an income qualified piece of the program. This is something that we actually feel strongly about making sure gets supported in all of these programs, is that a lot of them will have either like a carve out for a certain percentage of the program to directly benefit income qualified participants. And there are some requirements there about who qualifies under that can be very state specific. And then also potentially even like financial incentive for developers to make sure their projects provide savings, reasonably significant savings for participants who are income qualified. And those programs are sort of all over. New Jersey has specific stipulations about this. Maryland does it a different way. Massachusetts has a different program for it. Illinois. So they're all trying different things, but with that idea that we want to make sure that everybody can participate. And then if somebody is income qualified or meets some other criteria with respect to living in a frontline community, for example, that those benefits do in fact flow to those participants.
Great, thank you. Next question from Penny. Penny asks, what is it in a solar panel that wears out after 25 years? Can they be repaired and put back in use?
I love that question. All sorts of different things can wear out. It could be the soldering connections of the things that connect the individual cells that are within the larger module. The modules themselves, the silicon modules themselves, degrade over time. Sometimes it might be like physical damage. The sun beating down on the panels can separate the laminates and cause problems to happen with respect to like conductivity within the panel. So there's all sorts of different environmental things that can happen. The panels themselves are built very sturdily to be able to resist all of those things, which, by the way, is one of the things that makes them harder to recycle, just in terms of the way that they've chosen to do that now, to have everything very tightly laminated and glued together within that aluminum frame. That presents some challenges. Not an expert in recycling, but those are just some of the few things that can happen over time. as with anything else that's in the sun for every day for 20 plus years.
Great. And if I could add some color on that too, we usually use 25 years as the length because that is the length that solar panels warranties last for. In many cases, they last for longer. They may not perform to the level that they have for the first 25 years, but they can even last sometimes 30 to 40 years if under the right conditions. So the next question, are we working on new technology to make panels last longer than 25 years?
I am not aware of any particular ones. Although I will say that the economic incentive for equipment to last is certainly there. Once the equipment has been paid for by incentives and the electricity value, it's essentially an asset that has no fuel supply cost, right? So for the people who are operating that array, it's to their benefit to keep it operating. So I think there are some sort of naturally built-in incentives for a plant operator to want that to happen, and I would imagine the industry is trying to support that. But 25 years is a fairly long time for this type of asset, and you will see projects also repower where they are taking out older equipment, hopefully finding a place to recycle it to, whether it's a recycled panel that gets put back in service, which doesn't happen a lot at this point, or recycling the materials and actually keep some of those components, but swap out other ones to keep a facility up and running. That part of the industry is, I think, a little bit less clear about how that will work over time, because the larger projects that were put in the beginning of the 2000s, those are starting to reach that point where businesses are thinking about, do I keep this asset running or do I try to replace it? So I think there's a very long way of saying, I'm not sure the industry necessarily has an incentive to keep them running for a really long time, but that 25-year window is already a pretty solid window in terms of the equipment producing at a high level with the warranties and other things that are in place. So we'll see what happens over the next decade or so, whether that trend gets longer or stays the same.
Great, thank you. And we're running a little short on time, so we'll wrap up with the last few questions here. But what advice would you give to someone moving forward after this meeting who's interested in getting community solar? How would you recommend starting? And also, what are some common challenges in the process that consumers should be ready for or should know how to address?
I think those questions are really closely connected. The thing that I would say is the most important is finding a resource in your state that can point you towards community solar, where to actually sign up. And as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a mixed bag as to how easy that is. Our site is one source, and in other states, there might just not be a lot of visibility. So I would say finding a reliable source of information in your state is a good place to start. If you are stuck on that, feel free to contact us. I know it's not a perfect answer. I wish there were a single place to go to learn all of these things, but it's just kind of all over based on the state's resources and what they've chosen to do to implement a program. It's one of the things that we think is kind of a big gap for consumers right now, is kind of knowing where to look for that information.
And then in terms of any challenges that a consumer might find beyond just the challenge of locating the programs in their area, anything that consumers should be aware of entering the process?
Understanding the contract requirements, I think, are helpful. Some key questions to ask. We have some more information on our website as far as things to look at in a contract. For most markets that are more mature, those terms should be pretty favorable and short contract lengths. But for newer markets, you might see ones where the contract is 10 years or 20 years. That's less and less likely. But just sort of understanding those requirements in your agreement is important. Generally speaking, though, it's a pretty solid product in places where it's offered. Onboarding is relatively easy. You might have to wait a little bit until the project is finished to be able to get those credits. So that's a point that can be of confusion for people. In other words, if the project is going to be finished in December, they have to sign people up for a couple of months. So if you sign up in June, you might wait for 6 months if it's a new project versus coming onto an existing one. So I would say that's a challenge, is just expectations for participants as to when their credits will show up and when things start to happen.
Great. Thanks, Corey. Well, that's about all the time we have. If anyone still on the call has any questions, still feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll probably hang around for a couple minutes and try to answer any that we can. But Corey, Fatima, thank you so much for your time. This was great, and thanks everyone for attending. I hope you learned a lot about community solar and feel equipped to move forward. And again, Solar United Neighbors has great resources. EcoWatch has some resources. And again, if you have any last second questions, feel free to drop them in and we'll do our best to get to them. Otherwise, a recording of the webinar will be sent out via email. And thanks everyone again.
Thank you, Karsten.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you.
EcoWatch and your invitation.